In this video, I'm going to go in depth on how I made my first deck board that will span the rear of my two pontoons. I've also made a shorter overview video you might want to watch instead. Because the captive nuts on my pontoons are inexactly placed by hand about every foot and about 6 inches in from the edges, I needed to transfer their positions to my deck boards. So I needed to place my pontoons in the exact positions I wanted them to be held by the deck boards, making sure they're even, square, and level as possible on my working surface. Luckily, I already had a supply of pressure-treated 2x4s because COVID-19 supply chain issues were making lumber expensive. However, I needed to pick through them to find the best option to use as the rear support. I've chosen this particular pressure-treated 2x4 because it bows kind of like that. So the goal here is to have that foam piece bow just slightly so that any rain drops on the center will go off to the edges and wash off. I'm going to be embedding that into the back of this deck board, not so much for structural support, although obviously it's going to help a little bit. If I want to do structural support, I'd probably put it on the bottom. But this is mostly for mounting things to the back of the boat, like motors and so forth. So I want a good heavy-duty piece of wood that I can really screw into or put some bolts through that's fiberglassed over a wide area to the deck board. I had also laid in a supply of 3/4 inch foam board insulation to use as the foam core for my fiberglass deck boards before I sold my truck. I'm making the width of my front and back deck boards 35 inches so that the chopped strand mat from my 39-inch wide roll will fit evenly over the board and the 2x4 with just enough left over to go over one edge. This also puts 6 bolts from each pontoon into the front and rear deck boards and 4 in the center deck board, which will be narrower. I peel the protective plastic off of the foam, as epoxy doesn't stick super well to it, which I can use to my advantage later on. It also makes popping bolts through the foam easier. I laid this piece of foam, which is 8 feet wide by 35 inches, down, and I made sure that the factory edges were on the two sides in the back. And I used that to verify that my pontoons were basically level and straight and the right distance apart and so forth. And then I pushed them down onto the bolts. And pushing them down onto bolts works amazingly well, much better than I had any right to expect. All you do is you find a place where the bolt is, and you push force down all around that place, and it pops through and makes a perfect little plug if you wanted to put it back in. I'm not going to, but just perfect. I thought I was going to have to use a hole saw or something to clean this up, but it works amazingly well. I dry fit everything with my sawhorses and clamps holding the foam and the pressure treated 2x4 together. So now it's time to mix up some epoxy. The first deck board was a learning experience. I now have plastic over my sawhorses so that epoxy won't stick to them. And when I use clamps, I put some wax paper or plastic between them and the epoxy. But mostly I use a bit less epoxy so it drips less. Due to the bow and the 2x4, I also mixed up some epoxy paste to get a nice smooth transition from the end of the foam to the 2x4. The foam insulation board needs more support than just a few sawhorses to maintain the proper shape when laying down fiberglass, so I unfolded my big table. This table has the advantage that the two ends already slightly slope downwards, which is approximately the shape I wanted my deck board to have. I'm reusing the protective plastic I removed to keep my workpiece from sticking to the table. I ran the sander over the 2x4 just to make sure the epoxy would have a good connection to it. The wood's so porous that probably wasn't strictly necessary. Because I chose the width of my deck boards based upon my fiberglass roll width, I only need to cut the chopped strand mat to length. I used wide masking tape to hold one end of the chopped strand mat to the end of the foam board, and then made cuts on the other end so it would be easy to wrap around the bowing 2x4. On the fourth day of work, I opened a new gallon of epoxy resin and wetted out the chopped strand mat. I did the 2x4 side first, and after that was adhering well, removed the masking tape and rolled epoxy over the other half of the deck board. Because I'm using slow cure hardener, after I put down one layer of epoxy, I let it dry for a day. I didn't really know how many layers of chop strand mat I would need to get the strength needed for people to stand on the deck board between the two pontoons. So on this first deck board, I was really going layer at a time and then testing the rigidity to get an idea of how much strength each layer gave me. On my second deck board, I would sometimes put down all the layers for a side in a single extra long layup. I left an edge of fiberglass hanging off the end of my 2x4 and needed to cut it off. I tried a router with the following bit, and that didn't work at all. It left a messy edge and a lot of fibers everywhere. Using an oscillating saw with a cutoff blade is definitely the way to go here. I've flipped this over. There's probably about a half gallon of epoxy resin impregnated in the chop strand mat on the other side. And you can see there's these holes that I've punched through the plastic, the foam, and there's one layer of chop strand mat with epoxy at the bottom. My plan is to mix up some glass bead epoxy putty, very liquidy, and pour it in all of these holes to fill the holes in before I cover this bottom side with chop strand mat. At the same time, I'm going to put fiberglass cloth tape around these three edges that do not have the 2x4 attached to them. So I'm going to do the cloth tape first, then mix in the epoxy, the micro balloons into the epoxy, and use that to fill in these guys. And before I do that, I'm going to be sanding down a few places where we have like drips of epoxy sticking up, because I want those to be flat as well when I put the mat on top of that. I also hit the edges here where there's a couple of places where it dripped. Nobody's going to be standing on this thing with just one layer of chop strand mat on it, but you can see I put the leaves of the table down, so this is supported in the center, and it definitely has more rigidity than just a piece of the foam board by itself. This is the 6-ounce density woven fiberglass tape, 3-inch wide. I have one on each side cut out here. I'm going to be rolling these up and preparing to dip them into the epoxy in here and then squeegeeing them as I come out of the epoxy to pretty much, completely coat these guys with epoxy. They're going to be wrapped around these edges like so. I have my dirty fiberglass scissors here because, for example, at these edges I'm going to have to make a cut right there so it'll stick on the back of that 2x4, and then this part will wrap around. I really can't do that until after they're wet. I don't think I'll be able to keep track of which end has the cut and so forth, so I'm not going to even bother making that cut till they're wet. And that's why I have dirty fiberglass covered scissors. My plan is to mix the epoxy in this, get my cloth tape wet and lay it up, and then pour the epoxy and the glass balloons, glass bead micro balloons into this dirty one, which has had glass bead balloons in it before. You can see it's harder to get the glass bead balloon epoxy completely out of the cups. Here I'm soaking the 3-inch wide fiberglass cloth tape in epoxy resin and putting them along each of the 4 sides. Then I pour the very thin epoxy micro balloon mixture into the holes to cover them with a square of cloth tape. I sanded and vacuumed the edges and holes, and then got ready to lay down 3 layers of chop strand mat in a single session. Alright, let's talk dimensions of materials. The distance between my 2 ponds is about 29 inches, so it's about 40.5 to 41 inches between those bolts. What that means is my chop strand mat, which is fiberglass on a roll, comes at a 39-inch width, and that'll go right between those 2 bolts. So here, if I cut some 35-inch long things that are 39 inches wide, they'll go right from that bolt hole right to that bolt hole. So I have 2 layers of this. One's going to be on the bottom, and then I'm going to have here, so from this place here all the way down and around to there is 39 inches. So if I cut one that's 104 inches long that way, that'll be my second layer, and then my third layer will be this guy here that goes on top. So my plan is to do 3 layers of fiberglass in the center and only 1 on the 2 edges, at least on this layup. So in this layup I'm going to be doing 3 separate, relatively large pieces to keep from having to sand in between the layers. You may notice that when I laid down this second layer, it came off the roll this way, so I'm using that roll to keep rolling. I've cut, 6 to 8 inch sections here. This edge is mostly straight, but it never hurts to be able to overlap just slightly to make sure there's no wrinkles there. And especially on the back edge here, I've done that all the way down because I know that board isn't fully straight. It warps a little bit, and I set it up to warp out in the center. So I'll definitely need these guys to kind of go around that curve as I lay it out. Okay, so here's the plan on how the fiberglass is going to go down. This bit will go there. I fold this bit down, and then that bit wraps around, and then these bits go underneath like that and wrap around the edge. So that's the plan. Now I roll this whole thing up, and we start laying down the first layer. This will be the second layer, and then we put the third layer on top of it in the center. Alright, this is the first layer. Normally, if I was laying down just a single layer, I would trim this so that it didn't wrap around that little 45-degree bend there. Right now I have it wrapping around, but there's only like a ½ inch going around, and so normally the tackiness of the epoxy wouldn't be enough to hold that chop strand mat down while it's set up. I'd be hitting that thing with a brush, chip brush, going back and forth there, and it'd keep popping up for a long time. However, because I know I'm doing 3 layers here, and the next layer goes on it and wraps all the way around on this big flat piece here, the 2x4, I'm just going to put this down, and I won't even try to push this part down until I put the next layer on it. And the weight of that next layer will hold this in, put up a little bit more bulk to fill in the gap there, that 45-degree gap, and wrap around. So when you're doing multiple layers, you can take advantage of the fact that you know there's going to be a few more layers on top to do things like that. The next day, I did the actual triple layer layup. When working with chop strand mat, I always wet down the foam first and then lay down the fiberglass because the mat absorbs a lot of epoxy, and I want to make sure that I have a full coat on the bottom. I use a ½ inch diameter aluminum head laminating roller to spread the epoxy out on the chop strand mat, as opposed to a plastic squeegee spreader that you might use on woven fiberglass. The full layup took over an hour, so I only have video of the first 2 layers going down, but the third layer is just another 39-inch wide piece in the center, much like the first layer except just slightly shorter so it doesn't go over the edge. The chop strand mat absorbs a lot of epoxy, so you want to be sure to have an extra gallon on hand and ready to go. There are 3 layers of chop strand mat in the middle here, going down to 1 layer on either side. On the bottom there's just 1 layer all the way across. And now I'm starting to see some of the rigidity I'm looking for. So it looks like after I flip it over and put a couple more layers on what will be the top surface, this thing might be pretty good, and then I can add a couple of struts going across this way on the bottom, and that might be enough for me. But right now, it's definitely supporting its own weight, solid board. I can push on it and it deflects, but I can put a decent amount of weight on it. I don't think I'll be standing on it just yet, but it's getting closer. And the dip in the center there is deliberate. That's a dip that's going to be a raise in the center when I turn it over, so rain will fall off. And you compare that to the original foam, and so what I have now is 1 layer of chop strand mat on the top and bottom, and in the middle I have 3 layers of chop strand mat in that middle 39 inches there. But on the other side, on what's going to be the top, what's now the bottom in the view, that's just a single layer there. So we're getting some rigidity now. Of course, before I can put down more layers of fiberglass on the top surface, I need to sand it down to make a good surface to bond to, and cut off any bits of fiberglass that were not entirely flat when I wrapped them around. So I laid a layer of chop strand mat over these holes. I flipped it over and I filled in the holes with glass micro balloon epoxy putty, and then I put some a square of woven fiberglass on the bottom, and then I've put another layer of chop strand mat on the bottom. It's getting a little hard to see these on the bottom, so I'm going to go ahead and drill all the way through the fiberglass glass beads here, just kind of making an indexing hole in what I look to be the center of these spots when I can still see them well. And then I'll be putting some more fiberglass on top and maybe even the bottom. But these will make it easy to find to drill back through as I put more fiberglass layers on. And these holes are going to be enlarged quite a bit as I get the 1/4 inch bolts through them. And then also I'm assuming I'm going to have to move them around a little bit to line up perfectly with what's on the actual pontoon. So I expect these holes to probably be about a 1/2 inch holes by the time I'm done with it. I want the center of my deck boards to be higher than the ends so that water will flow off the sides of the boat. But I was developing more of a bend up than I wanted right here in the very center point. So I brought another piece of board over here, and I've clamped it down, and I'm going to be putting a piece of fiberglass here in the center portion, and I'm going to do that while it's clamped down to try to get that bow down a little bit more. If I was professional doing a lot of these, I would have built a table with the exact right bend I wanted and just built my thing on top of the table, or a jig or a form. But I'm not making that many of these guys, and so I'm just kind of doing this one-off. So this is 39 inches wide, which is the width of a roll, and I've cut it to 36 inches so it will go up over that edge just a little bit. I'm going to show you here why I do need to still clip a few places vertically here, because that is not a perfect 90-degree angle, and so when I push it in against here, you can see there's some wrinkles that would form, and so by cutting a few vertical slips, it lets that curve around the fact that that board is just slightly curved. Now when I push it in, these guys can overlap or split apart as needed to prevent wrinkles forming. Obviously, if I was using a binder, or if I was using an epoxy soluble binder, this wouldn't be an issue, but since I'm using chopped strand mat that would only dissolve in the polyurethane resin, which I'm not using, then you have to do things like this. I've already done the side near the 2x4, and now I'm finishing up the half that will go under the clamp. I'm using a piece of plastic between the clamp and the epoxy so I can get it off again. To give you a feeling about how much resin something like this takes, this is 2 ounces per square foot chopped strand mat, and this particular piece is 39 inches wide by 36 inches long. And so it's basically a square yard or a square meter. It's pretty close to that. I used 36 ounces of mixed resin for this. I didn't have much left over. I had a little bit to coat the top of that board, but I really would actually like a little bit more resin left in my containers, my mixing containers, to make it easy to pull out the bottom later on. So basically, it's 36 ounces here for about a square yard or a square meter. Alright, I have 3 layers on the bottom and 1 layer on the top, and it was curved more than I wanted, so I clamped it down to this big board to hold it in place while I put 1 layer on the middle of the top here, and I let it dry for 2 days just to make sure it's fully solid. 1 layer of this chopped strand mat is still a little bit, you can push in on it if there's no backing behind it, so I'm not sure how much this is going to actually hold things down, but we're going to find out now. Well, actually, was at 31, it went up maybe 1/4 of an inch. Let's do the sides here. Okay, they didn't go up much at all, actually. Let's try the other side. So that went up slightly. So it was at 31, it's less than 31.5. I mean, obviously if you change this thing around, but it went up less than a 1/2 inch there from where I had it clamped, so that definitely was helpful. Repeat after me. You should never use a human as your weight for a static test. Alright, that thing's just about at the 5-inch mark. That's how much displacement you get. This is the last full piece I'll be putting on the top of this deck board. You can see, if you follow the line along that back 2x4, how the back 2x4 bends out just slightly, because otherwise that line would be straight. And I am wrapping it around all of these three sides here to make things look hopefully nice and neat. I'll have to be sure to tack these guys here up underneath well without any wrinkles. This is going to be 3 layers of the chopped strand mat in the center portion here, and it'll be 2 layers on either side, which are on top of the pontoons. I might put some more Crosswise ribs underneath this board after I do a little bit of tests to see how much it deflects with a lot of weight on it. At the beginning of this video, I opened a new gallon of epoxy resin. That gallon mixes with a half gallon of hardener. During this layup, I had to open a new gallon of epoxy resin, so I've used 1.5 gallons of mixed resin up to this point. The entire deck board, including the struts I'll be putting on the bottom, took right around 2 gallons of mixed resin. Getting the folds fully wetted out and tacky enough to stick to the underside of the deck board took me a little practice to get right. I basically fold the tabs over so that I can pour resin on them, with excess resin falling into the layer below them. Once they're fully wetted out, I fold them over and use a chip brush and my gloved hands to make sure they're sticking to the underside well. Sometimes if I'm using a brand new batch of resin, I'll let them sit for a while to get tacky before I try and fold them over. I sanded this guy, vacuumed it, turned it over, sanded it and vacuumed it again on the bottom. You can see some of the holes that I drilled through stayed just fine, but a lot of them had epoxy fill in either partially or completely from the top, so a lot of epoxy popped in, so I had to sand those holes down in addition to all these edges that were folded over. And since I had the sander out, I just did the whole flat surface again just to make sure it was scuffed up for paint. So now I need to drill these guys. I think if they have a good hole on one side, I'm going to drill it from this side, otherwise I'll flip it over and drill it from the top. Well, it's not light, certainly lighter than the equivalent amount of 2x6s or composite deck boards, but it's definitely up there. Maybe 50 pounds? So about 53 pounds. Now comes the moment of truth. Will the holes match up? It had been a while since I popped the holes on the foam board, so I had to clean up the pontoons, remove a few bolts, and measure to make sure they hadn't been bumped. So a limited number of these holes, I got lucky, and the 1/4-inch holes actually line up exactly with the nuts that are embedded below them. The rest of them, I've gone out to 13 64ths, and or maybe it's 13 32nds, but I made them larger. So we'd have a little bit of wiggle room so things would work. And even those, a few of those, it's right at the edge, so I'm going to be marking those and making those particular holes a little bit bigger so that everything will line up to the holes underneath. Alright, I put a trash can underneath the hole. I found that even holes that don't need to be expanded like this one, if they have a little bit of rough edges there, benefit from a file. Go around a little bit, cleans up the edge very nicely. You could do this with a Dremel or some type of power tool, but I've found just a metal file will eat through this fiberglass pretty quickly. I mean, it takes a little bit of elbow grease, but it gives you good control. And you can just expand the hole until you don't see the magic marker anymore. After filing out the holes, I'm able to get all the bolts in at the same time. Then I can figure out the correct bolt length to buy and do some strength tests. Alright, so what exactly is the minimum and maximum bolt length I should be buying for this attachment point? Well, right there's the maximum. I put it on top of the pontoon. That's the minimum, so somewhere between there and there. Try that for a few other holes to make sure. Alright, so these marks here are the depth of my foam from the top of the deck board to the pontoon, depending on bends and bows and different thicknesses of fiberglass. These marks down here are the depths to the bottom of my hole. So it looks like about 1.5 inches is the bolt length I want to buy. Engineering. No weight on it. All my weight right at the edge. Probably going to put a couple of beams or struts across the bottom, but it doesn't look like it needs too much. If you're going to be doing a project like this, especially in a place open to wind outside, I definitely recommend taping down the edges of your drop cloths. Here I'm also replacing one of my old shower curtains that had gotten ripped a bit. While the deck board was on the pontoons, I got under it and drew a line following the edge of the pontoons to know exactly where I could put the Crosswise support stars. This is the underside of my deck board, and from this pencil line to that pencil line is where it's unsupported by pontoons. So I'm going to put a couple of Crosswise spars, basically pieces of foam sticking up covered with fiberglass to give it more support here when people stand in the middle. So comparing it to the factory edge on this foam board, you can see that's the bend I have in there for water to run off the center of the pontoon. Well, when I went down to 26¼ inches here, there is a gap. You know, it's maybe 1/4 inch, but I'm just going to fill all that in with epoxy putty, probably my glass bead epoxy putty, because that's not really what's providing the strength. It'll be the fiberglass that goes from this side down to that side there that's going to be providing the strength. No, the foam underneath there isn't going to be providing any strength. That'll make things easier because I can just cut straight lines. Okay, these are our Crosswise reinforcing struts. I put them 5 inches apart. I have 1.25 inches of the cloth tape on each side of these, so I need at least 2.5 inches between them, so probably 3 inches between them. Just working in there, putting fiberglass in, I think 5 inches is going to be a lot easier. I cut a lot of them, and if this was the center deck board, it'd probably look like this, but because this is the back deck board and there's a giant 2x4 up there, I certainly don't need this guy. I also happen to know there's going to be a seat that's 16 inches wide across the entire back of the pontoon boat, and that's going to be taking any weight of passengers and moving it to the pontoons already, so I don't need these guys here. So really on this one I'm only going to have these 4. Just mark with a pencil. I can get these boards basically right back where they were before. You do have to get the ends of them marked. So this is the plan. I mix up a small batch of resin and I get these pieces of fiberglass tape full of resin, leaving them in the plastic paper plate. I paint resin along these lines where those guys will be stuck down. I put those guys onto the resin and put the weights on top of it. I also paint resin around all these corners where I have holes to patch. So that's where I'm going to be using the cloth tape. And then I dump the remaining resin, and hopefully there'll be enough, into my disposable container with glass beads, mix up some putty, put the putty into my bag that has a little tiny bit chopped off the corner, and I can pipette the glass bead putty or paste into these 3 corner holes, and then get these guys, wrap them around there, dab them with the brush to try to keep them in place. Come back over here and put fillets on the edges of those struts. We'll see how well that works when I actually start mixing things. Well, that went okay. The corners are covered. I put too much epoxy in the glass beads, and even adding another scoop of glass beads, it's much too runny. It's not really a paste so much as a soup. So I'm not getting a super good fillet, but it's kind of rounded just because of surface tension, if nothing else. So I'm going to deal with that. It is what it is, and it's not terribly critical that this fiberglass looks super smooth anyway, since it's under the deck board. I saved most of my offcuts from the pontoon nose cones in a box and put them to good use here. I'm cutting chop strand mat strips to fit on the sides of the foam spars. And is that this will be my last layer on top of these struts. And it's going to overlap the end of the struts slightly, so probably down to like there. If you're having a hard time visualizing how this cut and fold works, I'll lay it out here somewhat flat. So you can see I'm basically cutting in and then down. When you lay that there, this edge goes down there and these guys fold over there. And of course I'm going to be chip brushing all those loose strands down. Alright, so the general plan is I'll put down this 6-inch wide cloth tape. Then I'm going to be layering up a couple of layers of vertical chop strand mat support. Maybe some thicker layers of chop strand mat that will bridge between there and there, pushed in. And then on top of this, I'll be putting the thin layer of cloth that'll cover the top edge and wrapping the ends with these little pieces here at the ends. So I'm going to be doing this all as a single layup so that I don't have to sand between the edges, and that hopefully everything will be stuck together quite well to build up some strengthened ribs underneath this place here that's not supported by the pontoons. In this layup, I put down the 6-inch wide woven tape over the foam struts, then built up about 3 layers of chop strand mat on each side of the struts. I'm dipping the chop strand mat into epoxy in a container to wet it out in some cases, and pressing chop strand mat into any puddles that form on the base of the struts to pick up stray epoxy. Finally, I put a 3-inch wide woven fiberglass tape over the top of the struts to hide the edges of the mostly vertical chop strand mat layers and tie everything together. Just enough left over so that I didn't have too little. After the epoxy setup, I had to vacuum up some stray fibers left over from where I had staged my dry fiberglass, and then sand down all the rough edges on the struts. In future deck boards, I moved the struts so that they're far enough apart so that I can get my small orbital sander in between them. Then I moved it back to the pontoons and did some more deflection tests. The deck board felt much sturdier with the struts. It flexes less than this if I screw all the bolts down. So these 4 struts add about 1 pound each, so I added about 4 pounds to my deck board, but it is significantly stiffer than it was before. So I feel this is plenty of strength for a deck board, and it's time to build my next 2 deck boards. Of course, I have to paint the deck board before I can build more. I'm using Rust-Oleum TopSide paint, which requires 24 hours between coats to fully cure. So the next 5 days were spent putting 2 coats on the bottom and top. Here I'm using a chip brush to do the bottom side. You need to lightly sand each coat to allow the next coat to adhere properly. So this deck board is 8 feet wide by 35 inches long. I've used a little more than half a quart to do just this side here, and I've done 2 layers or 2 coats in the middle where it's not sitting on top of pontoons. This is the bottom, because light might reflect off the lake and back up into here. I've only done 1 coat in the center here where it's going to be sitting on top of a pontoon, but I have done 2 coats around the edges. So I'm going to be flipping this thing over and doing the other side, which is the side we're going to be standing on. I eventually found that 4-inch foam cabinet rollers are the fastest and easiest way to apply this paint. This is the Rust-Oleum Gloss White. This is about just a little under a half a quart here, put down with a foam roller. You can see there's a couple of places, like here, where I definitely need a little more, or here, or there. And there's some other areas where it's basically a solid coat. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to do 2 coats of this. I might put down 3 coats. I'm also going to have to put some skid guard down on this front half where there's going to be a bench seat on the back half for the back 16 inches. So on the front half it's going to be walkable area. And right now with the fiberglass pattern here, it's relatively non-skid, but I'm going to be covering up a lot of that, and it's going to be more like this. And I also suspect when it gets wet it's going to be a lot slicker. So we're going to put some anti-skid into the paint in at least that front half. But before I paint it, I'm going to have to hit it with some 220 grit sandpaper to scuff things up so the second layer will stick well. When working on big projects like this, the sanding and painting gets repetitive. It would have been nicer to fiberglass all 3 deck boards and then paint them all in parallel, but I didn't really have enough room in my garage to store 2 deck boards or paint all 3 at once. So I decided to paint them one at a time so that I could store them outside in the sun on the pontoons. Here you can see I'm applying anti-skid sand directly to the top of the paint on the front of this deck board. It's amazing how much dirt washes off my roof onto this pontoon. Here I'm washing it a bit before attaching the deck board for storage. This is the mounting hardware I'm using. We have 818 stainless steel truss head Phillips screws with washers so that it won't fall through the holes in the cases where the holes are bigger. I also have a non-abrasive washer which is going to go underneath between the pontoon and the deck board just to keep those things from scraping on each other too much. It's going to have one on each of these guys. It takes a bit of fiddling to get the rubber washers positioned between the pontoons and the deck boards, but I eventually managed to get them all in place and the deck board fastened down. So now I have the rear deck board finished. Next up, building the front deck board, the middle deck board, and then a bench seat across the back. Sometime in the future, I may also build 2 smaller side seats and some type of sun cover, but I'm going to put it in the water before getting to that.